The struggle was daily. The cold cut to the bone, hunger gnawed, and the roof leaked on rainy nights. But Ilara, with the wisdom of one who knows the value of persistence, taught them to light fires with dry branches, to clean the moss from the walls, and to transform the uninhabitable into a refuge. As they worked, Grandfather told stories of ancient lords and a forgotten treasure, whispered in the legends of Grey Hill, a secret that he claimed awaited rediscovery by those with courage and a pure heart. Grandfather's stories weren't just tales to pass the time, they were seeds of a nearly forgotten hope, planted in the barren soil of their existence. The children, wide-eyed, absorbed every word about Grey Hill, a place that in legends held not just a treasure, but the promise of a new beginning. For Ilara, however, hope was a luxury she could rarely afford. Her days were a tapestry of worries woven with the threads of hunger and cold. Where Grandfather saw gold and legends, Ilara saw only the cruel reality of an approaching winter, threatening to swallow what little they had left. Still, the idea of Grey Hill began to corrode the wall of her resignation. Where they were now, the roof leaked, the wind howled through the cracks, and food dwindled daily. What did they have to lose? The question echoed in her mind during the long nights, as she watched her children sleep, fragile and innocent. She remembered the sparkle in their eyes when Grandfather spoke of a place where abundance awaited, a place for those with courage and a pure heart. Ilara had courage to spare, forged in the furnace of adversity, and her heart, though heavy, was pure in its dedication to her children. The decision didn't come from a moment of epiphany, but from a slow and painful acceptance that staying was more dangerous than leaving. One cold morning, with the sun still lazy on the horizon, Ilara gathered the children. Their faces, marked by weariness and curiosity, awaited her words. "We're going to look for Grey Hill," she announced, her voice firmer than her heart felt. A murmur of excitement ran through the small group, mixed with a glimpse of fear of the unknown. The journey began. With each step, Ilara felt the weight not only of their few belongings, but of the responsibility for 5 lives. The path was treacherous, the trails ill-defined, and the landscape, once familiar in its desolation, now transformed into a labyrinth of twisted trees and jagged rocks. The wind, a constant companion, seemed to whisper warnings, carrying with it the echoes of stories that said Grey Hill was cursed, a place no one in their right mind dared to visit. The children, despite their exhaustion, showed surprising resilience. The eldest, at 10 years old, tried to carry what he could, while the youngest in Ilara's arms alternated between sleep and hungry cries. Ilara recounted Grandfather's stories again, not to entertain them, but to keep the flame of hope alive in their hearts and in her own. She spoke of the treasure, not as gold and jewels, but as a safe home, with warm food and walls that didn't leak. Days dragged into weeks. Hunger was a constant companion, and water was often found in muddy puddles. Ilara taught them to identify edible berries and to set small traps for hunting. Each night, under an indifferent starry sky, she huddled with her children, feeling the warmth of their small bodies as the only barrier against the relentless cold. The tension was palpable, a thread stretched between hope and despair. They were moving away from the little they knew, towards a place everyone avoided. And with each mile, doubt tightened its grip. Was Grandfather right, or were they walking towards an even darker end? It was late one afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, that they saw it. Grey Hill rose in the distance, not as imposing as in the legends, but undeniably present, and nestled at its foot was the village. It wasn't a vibrant, welcoming village, but a collection of dark, silent houses, their windows empty like lifeless eyes. A thin mist hung over the buildings, giving them a spectral air. The silence was what frightened them most. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no dog barked, no child laughed. Only the wind, which now seemed more a sigh than a howl, stirring the weeds that grew wild between the street stones. Stories about the village, whispered in cautionary tones, returned to Ilara's mind. An abandoned place, forgotten, perhaps cursed, a place no one dared to inhabit. The children pressed against her, their small faces pale. "Mommy, is this it?" one of them asked, their voice a frightened whisper. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The sight was not of a refuge, but of a graveyard of dreams. Yet, there was no turning back. They had burned their bridges. With a last breath of determination, Ilara squeezed her children's hands and began to descend the slope towards the oppressive silence of the abandoned village. The treasure, if it existed, would be inside. But what else awaited them in those empty houses? Fear was a knot in her throat, but hope, however fragile, still pulsed. They stood at the door of the unknown, a threshold between legend and reality, between desolation and the promise of something extraordinary. The village's silence was a living entity, more terrifying than any wolf's howl or wind's cry. Every step Ilara and her children took on the dirt road seemed to echo, amplified by the absence of any other sound. The houses, with their empty windows and half-open doors, seemed to watch, their roofs bowed under the weight of time and abandonment. There was no smoke, no smell of food, not the slightest sign of life, only the damp scent of old wood and earth. The children clung to her, their eyes wide, absorbing the heavy atmosphere that hung like a shroud over the place. Fear was palpable, but the exhaustion of the journey and the promise of a roof over their heads pushed them forward. Ilara chose the first house on the right, closest to the entrance. Its heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, creaking with the lightest breeze. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to retreat, but the image of her hungry, shivering children was a whip that drove her forward. With a hesitant push, the door groaned open to darkness. The interior was a mix of dust and cobwebs, with furniture covered by tattered sheets like ghosts of a past life. The kitchen, with its cold fireplace and dusty pots, seemed to have been abandoned in haste. No sign of treasure, just the melancholy of a forgotten home. Tension was a tight knot in Ilara's stomach. They had risked everything for this, for a place that seemed only a tomb for dreams. As the children huddled, Ilara began to inspect the house, driven by desperate determination. She opened cupboards, searched corners, but found only more dust and emptiness. With each room, hope dwindled, replaced by growing despair. Was grandfather merely a dreamer? Was Grey Hill just another cruel legend? It was in the main bedroom, the largest in the house, that something caught her eye. In the corner, beneath a pile of dusty blankets, there was an unusual bulge in the wooden floor. It wasn't a natural defect, but something that seemed to have been covered. With her heart pounding, Ilara pushed aside the blankets and with trembling hands began to pull up the loose floorboards. The wood groaned, giving way, and revealed a secret compartment. Inside, there wasn't just one, but 3 dark wooden chests, untouched, as if they had been waiting for her. The air seemed to thin. Ilara knelt, her breath caught in her throat. The chests had no locks, just simple metal clasps. With trembling fingers, she opened the first. Her eyes, accustomed to darkness and misery, were blinded by a golden gleam. Gold coins, thousands of them stacked, shimmering in the gloom. The second chest revealed more coins, and the third, jewels encrusted in gold and silver, precious stones that sparkled with their own light. A muffled cry escaped her throat. It wasn't a cry of fear, but of pure disbelief, of a joy so overwhelming it bordered on pain. The children, who until then had watched in frightened silence, approached, their small faces reflecting the golden light emanating from the chests. "Mummy, what is this?" asked the eldest, his voice a whisper of awe. Ilara couldn't speak. She just looked at the gold, then at her children, and tears, long held back, began to stream down her face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude, of a hope she had sworn never to feel again. Grandfather's treasure wasn't a legend, it was real, and it was there untouched, waiting for them. But the initial euphoria was quickly tempered by a new wave of questions. Why so much gold? Why was it hidden? And above all, why was the village completely abandoned if its inhabitants possessed such wealth? Joy mingled with a pang of apprehension. That gold was a blessing, yes, but also a mystery, an invitation to an enigma Ilara knew she would have to unravel. As the golden light from the chests illuminated her children's faces, Ilara felt a mix of power and vulnerability. They had found salvation, but they had also stumbled upon a secret that seemed too vast for them. The village's silence, once merely frightening, now seemed to hold a story, a warning. They were rich, yes, but alone, in a place everyone avoided. Night was falling outside, and the wind, which once whispered warnings, now seemed to carry even deeper secrets. The journey had ended, but the real adventure, the one involving survival and understanding of that cursed place, was just beginning. They had gold, but what else did Grey Hill hold in store for them? The golden light from the chests danced in the children's wide eyes, transforming the darkness of the room into a stage of wonders. Ilara, kneeling, felt the weight of the gold in her trembling hands, but it was the weight of responsibility that oppressed her most. The tears, once of pure relief, now mingled with a pang of anxiety. Grandfather was right, there was a treasure. But why was it there? Why untouched? Night advanced, and the cold of the abandoned house began to make itself felt, even with the euphoria of the discovery. Ilara, with superhuman effort, pushed the floorboards back to cover the chests. The gold was real, but safety was an illusion. They couldn't sleep with such wealth exposed, not even hidden under a loose floor. The village was too silent, too empty. That silence was a predator, and the gold its bait. With a nod, she gathered the children, who were still whispering about the coin's gleam. "We need a safe place for tonight," she said, her voice hoarse, "and we need food." Hunger, forgotten for a brief moment, returned to gnaw. Gold could not be eaten nor burned for warmth. They settled in the kitchen, the most sheltered room. Ilara lit a fire in the cold fireplace, using dry kindling she found in a basket. The warmth and the small flickering flame brought a drop of comfort. The children, exhausted, soon fell asleep, huddled together, the gleam of gold still in their dreams. Ilara, however, couldn't sleep. Her eyes swept the darkness, her ears alert to any sound beyond the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Those questions hammered in her mind. Who hid this gold? Why was the village abandoned so abruptly? There were no signs of struggle, of looting, just a sepulchral silence. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. The legend of Grey Hill, which spoke of a cursed place, now took on a new and terrifying meaning. At dawn, the pale sun barely penetrated the mist that still hung over the village. Ilara felt an urgent impulse to explore. She couldn't stay put, waiting for answers to come to her. She needed to understand what had happened there, not only to satisfy her curiosity, but to ensure her children's safety. If there was gold in one house, there might be in others, but more importantly, there might be clues. With the children still asleep, Ilara left the house. The cold morning air enveloped her, and the silence seemed even denser. She walked through the dirt streets, her heart pounding in her chest. Each house was a promise of discovery and an invitation to fear. The doors, many of them ajar, looked like hungry mouths. She chose the house opposite, a slightly larger building with a weathered porch. The door creaked open when pushed, revealing an interior identical to the first house. Dust, cobwebs, furniture covered by sheets. But there was something different. On the kitchen table, a wooden plate still held dried remnants of a meal, and a mug was overturned, as if knocked over in haste. A wooden toy, a small horse, lay on the floor near the cold fireplace. The scene was a snapshot of a life interrupted. Not of a planned departure, but of a sudden flight. What could have frightened the inhabitants so much that they abandoned their homes, their possessions, and even their treasures? The hidden wealth was not a secret, but a relic of a people who simply vanished. Ilara searched the house more carefully. In the main bedroom, under an old mattress, she found a small leather pouch. Inside, there was no gold, but a handful of silver coins and a few simple rings. It wasn't the treasure she had found in the first house, but it was further proof that wealth wasn't a secret kept by a single inhabitant. The entire village seemed to have been blessed with abundance and cursed with disappearance. With each new discovery, the tension mounted. The gold was real, but the story behind it was an abyss of mystery. Ilara felt like an intruder on a stage where the play had ended abruptly, leaving behind only the sets and props. Where were the actors? She returned to the first house, the sun already higher, but the cold still biting. The children had woken and awaited her, their faces curious. "Mommy, did you find anything else?" asked the eldest, his eyes shining with adventure. Ilara sat beside them, pulling them close. "I did," she replied, her voice laden with a gravity they couldn't comprehend. "I found more questions." She couldn't tell them about the abandoned plate of food or the toy left behind. She couldn't convey the silent terror that was beginning to root itself in her own heart. They had gold, they had a roof over their heads, but they were alone, in a village that seemed to have been swallowed by time, leaving behind only wealth and mystery. Grey Hill, with its air of a cursed legend, now seemed more real than ever. The journey had ended, but the real ordeal was just beginning. They had found the treasure, but what had the treasure brought them? The village's silence was no longer just frightening. It was a promise of secrets Ilara knew she would have to unravel, no matter the cost. Driven by this need, Ilara continued her search, house after house. The third house revealed a loom with unfinished fabric, needles still caught in the weave, as if the weaver had risen for a brief break and never returned. Beneath the creaking floor of the bedroom, more chests, filled with gold coins and rolls of fine silk. The fourth house, a small bakery, had cold ovens and untouched sacks of flour. In a corner, under a counter, a broken ceramic pot revealed a handful of raw gold nuggets. There were no signs of theft, of violence, of anything that could explain the absence. Only life, frozen in time, with its hidden wealth and its vanished inhabitants. With each discovery, Ilara's initial joy transformed into a sense of dread. It was as if the village had been swept away by an invisible force, a silent plague that took only the people, leaving behind their legacy of gold. The wealth was not a family secret, but a common characteristic of all the inhabitants of Grey Hill. This meant that the curse, or whatever had happened, had affected everyone. What could be so powerful as to make an entire village, rich and seemingly prosperous, simply disappear from the face of the earth? The sun began to set again, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but the beauty of the twilight could not dissipate the darkness settling in Ilara's heart. She returned to the first house, where the children played with one of the silver rings she had found, oblivious to the weight of the situation. Their smiles were a constant reminder of what was at stake. She couldn't afford to be afraid, not for long. But the mystery of Grey Hill was a heavy burden, and Ilara felt she was only scratching the surface of a secret far darker than any legend could describe. The gold was the bait, and they, unknowingly, had bitten. The real hunt, Ilara realized with a shiver, might not be theirs, but that of something still lurking in the shadows of that cursed village. The real hunt, Ilara realized with a shiver, might not be theirs, but that of something still lurking in the shadows of that cursed village. Night swallowed the last trace of daylight, and with it brought a darkness deeper than any Ilara had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of light, but a palpable presence, a heavy shroud of mystery and threat that stretched over Grey Hill. The silence, once merely frightening, now seemed to breathe, to pulse, like a predator lying in wait. The children slept deeply, their small bodies nestled together near the fireplace, which Ilara had restocked with the last dry wood she found. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, transforming harmless objects into grotesque figures. Ilara couldn't close her eyes. Every fiber of her being was on alert, her ears attentive to the slightest sound, her eyes sweeping the darkness beyond the reach of the light. Ilara's mind was a whirlwind, the gold, that treacherous gleam that promised salvation, but now seemed like a trap. Why would such a rich village be abandoned without a trace of struggle, without a single body? The unfinished meals, the stopped looms, the toys left behind, everything spoke of a sudden departure, not a planned migration. And most disturbing, the untouched wealth. No one looted the gold. No one took the silver coins. It was as if the inhabitants had fled from something so terrifying that the gold became irrelevant. The legend of Grey Hill, which her grandfather used to tell with a mysterious glint in his eyes, now resonated with terrifying clarity. It wasn't just a story of a cursed place, but a warning that Ilara, in her desperate search for hope, had ignored. What could be worse than the poverty and hunger that plagued her? She was about to find out. A creak, not from the wind nor the fire. A subtle sound, almost inaudible, coming from upstairs. Ilara froze, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. She held her breath, tense, waiting. The silence returned, even more oppressive, as if the entire village was holding its breath with her. She rose slowly, picking up a piece of charred wood from the fire, which was still warm, and used it to light a small candle she had found in the kitchen. The weak flame barely illuminated her steps, but it was better than total darkness. The children continued to sleep, oblivious. Ilara felt a pang of guilt for dragging them to this place, but what else could she have done? With the flickering candle in one hand and a fireplace poker in the other, a pathetic weapon, but the only one she had, Ilara ascended the creaking stairs. Each step was an echo in the empty house, amplifying the fear that consumed her. The air upstairs was colder, denser, laden with the smell of mold and something else, something indefinable, almost metallic. She stopped in the hallway, the candlelight dancing on the closed bedroom doors. From which one had the sound come? She approached the first bedroom, the one she had searched earlier, where she had found the first chest. The door was ajar. Ilara pushed it gently. The room was as she had left it. The dusty sheets covering the furniture, the hole in the floor with the boards replaced, nothing out of place. But then she heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost a sigh, coming from the next room. Was it the voice of the wind, playing with the window cracks, or something more? Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The legend of Grey Hill spoke of whispers in the wind, of voices calling names, of shadows dancing at the periphery of vision. She moved to the door of the neighboring room, the one she hadn't yet explored. It was closed. With a trembling hand, Ilara turned the cold doorknob. The door opened with a drawn-out screech, revealing a dark room. The candlelight revealed a wooden crib covered by a thin layer of dust. And on the floor, next to the crib, there was something. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a clue about the disappearance. It was a small cloth doll, worn and tattered, that seemed to have been left there. Recently, the dust around it was untouched, but the doll seemed to have been moved, or perhaps simply hadn't been there before. Ilara was sure she hadn't seen it when she peered into the room earlier. Her heart pounded. If someone had been there, who was it? And why the doll? She knelt, examining the object. It was a child's toy, simple, but it carried a strange energy. And then she noticed. In the doll's small cloth hand, there was a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Ilara unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, scribbled with charcoal, a simple figure of a person holding hands with other smaller figures. And above them, a dark silhouette with glowing red eyes. Below the drawing, a single word, written in a child's handwriting, "Flee." Ilara's blood ran cold. It wasn't a whisper from the wind. It wasn't a legend. It was a warning. And it wasn't old. The charcoal still seemed fresh. Someone had been there. Someone who knew what had happened. Someone who wanted her and her children to leave. But who? And what was the figure with red eyes? A noise, this time unmistakable, a heavy dragging sound coming from outside the house, followed by a metallic clang, as if something had been knocked over. Ilara extinguished the candle, the room plunging into total darkness. She cowered, the fireplace poker gripped in one hand, the crumpled drawing in the other. The silence returned, but now it was a silence laden with dread, the promise of an invisible presence. She could feel it. She wasn't alone. They weren't alone. The hunt had begun, and they were the prey. Darkness swallowed Ilara, dense and suffocating more than the mere absence of light. It was a darkness that seemed to have weight, that pressed on her ears, that stole the air from her lungs. The fireplace poker, once a pathetic weapon, was now just a cold, heavy piece of metal in her trembling hand. The crumpled drawing, with its childish and terrifying message, was clutched in the other. Flee. Flee. Where to, and from what? The creaking and metallic clang outside had ceased, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. It wasn't the silence of the night, but the silence of waiting, as if the whole world was holding its breath, awaiting the next move. Ilara could feel her own heart pounding erratically, a wild drum in her chest, echoing in the emptiness of the room. Every fiber of her body was on high alert, muscles tense, ready for flight or fight, though she knew fighting would be useless against the unknown. Her eyes tried to pierce the darkness, but there was nothing to see. The window, a slightly less dark patch on the wall, offered only the blackness outside. The smell of mold and damp earth, once just an old characteristic of the house, now seemed to carry a hint of something more sinister, something that didn't belong. Ilara's mind spun in a whirlwind. The cloth doll, the drawing, the childish handwriting, everything was recent. It wasn't a relic from the village's distant past. Someone had been there, someone who knew, someone who fled, and left a warning. The figure with red eyes in the child's drawing danced in her mind, a dark silhouette that seemed to materialize in the shadows of the room. Was this the curse, the thing that had swept away an entire village, leaving behind only gold and silence? A chilling thought ran down her spine. If the villagers fled, why did the gold remain? No one takes gold when fleeing from something so terrible that wealth becomes irrelevant. They fled so quickly they had no time to take anything, or whatever made them flee didn't care about the gold, it cared about the people. Downstairs, the children slept, oblivious. Their small bodies, so vulnerable, were the only reason Ilara was still standing. She couldn't afford to collapse. She couldn't surrender to the panic that threatened to consume her. She was the mother, the protector. But how could she protect her children from something she couldn't even see? Another sound, this time closer, a soft scratching coming from below. Not from inside the house, but from outside the house, near the foundation. It was a sound that seemed to scrape against the wood, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something. Ilara cowered even further, her body pressed against the cold wall. She tried to regulate her breathing, but it was useless. Each inhale was an effort, each exhale a muffled groan. Her ears were so strained they seemed to ache. She tried to identify the direction, the nature of the sound. It seemed to move, circling the house like a predator sniffing out its prey. What was that? The legend of Grey Hill spoke of shadows that moved, of whispers that called names, but this wasn't a whisper, it was a physical, real sound, promising a presence. The figure with red eyes in the child's drawing gained new and terrible clarity in her mind. Was that it? The thing the ancient villagers feared? She needed to see. She needed to know, but fear paralyzed her. If she moved, if she made the slightest sound, it would know she was there. But if she stayed still, and it came in. The decision was made in the heat of terror. She couldn't stay there, waiting. She had to get to the children. She had to protect them. But going downstairs, crossing the dark hallway, would be like crossing a minefield. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, Ilara began to retreat, step by step towards the bedroom door. Her feet barely touched the floor, trying to be as silent as possible. The fireplace poker was raised, ready for a useless blow. The drawing still in her hand was a constant reminder of the urgency. The scratching outside stopped. The silence returned, even heavier, more menacing. Ilara froze again, her heart in her throat. It had stopped. Had it sensed her presence? Was it waiting? Then a new sound, not a scratch, not a creak, a soft thump coming from the roof, as if something heavy had landed there. Ilara raised her eyes to the dark ceiling, feeling a shiver run through her entire body. The roof. It was on top of the house. The air in the room seemed to thin. Ilara felt dizzy, the world spinning around her. It wasn't an animal. Animals didn't do that. The figure with red eyes, the legend, everything fit into a horrifying pattern. A whisper. This time, unmistakable, not the wind, not an echo, a voice, faint, drawn out, coming from above, through the ceiling boards. Ilara couldn't distinguish the words, but the intent was clear. It was a sound that didn't belong to this world, a sound that promised darkness and despair. She had to get out of there. She had to get her children out of there. The gold, the hope. Everything turned to ashes before that sound. The hunt was no longer a distant possibility. It was a terrifying reality, and they were the prey. She began to crawl out of the room, panic taking over, knowing that every second counted, that the thing on the roof was listening, waiting. Every inch Ilara crawled backward was an eternity. Her body tense, muscles screaming in protest against the effort and fear. The whisper from the roof seemed to follow her movements, a macabre melody seeping into her mind. She finally reached the door, the cold wood beneath her trembling fingers. She pushed it gently, an almost inaudible creak, and slid into the hallway. The darkness there was even more oppressive, an endless tunnel leading to the stairs. The descent was torture. Each step creaked under her weight, a sound amplified by the deadly silence that enveloped her. Ilara clung to the handrail, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the slightly less dark patch that indicated the downstairs. The fireplace poker, once a pathetic weapon, was now just a cold, heavy piece of metal in her trembling hand. The crumpled drawing, with its childish and terrifying message, was clutched in the other. Flee! Flee! Where to? And from what? Downstairs, the scratching sound resumed, this time closer to the front door, as if the creature was testing the entrance, sniffing out her presence. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. It knew she was there. It knew she was moving. Upon reaching the ground floor, the darkness seemed to thicken, shadows dancing in her peripheral vision. She moved stealthily towards the room where the children slept, her heart pounding like a wild drum. The door was ajar. Ilara peered in, seeing the silhouettes of her children, small and defenseless, asleep on the makeshift mattresses. A wave of love and terror flooded her. She had to get them out of there. With the softest voice she could muster, almost a whisper, Ilara called, "Children, wake up, we need to go." The first to stir was little Tiago, the youngest, who grumbled and turned over. Then Anna, the eldest, sat up, her eyes wide in the darkness. "Mom, what is it?" "Shh," Ilara hissed, kneeling beside them. "Don't make a sound. We need to get out of here, now." She couldn't tell them about the whisper, about the thing on the roof, about the red eyes in the drawing. Not yet. "It's dangerous to stay here. We need to go to the forest." The other two, Pedro and Sofia, began to stir, confused and sleepy. Ilara helped them up, the urgency in her movements contagious. "We can't take anything," she instructed, her voice firm despite the panic. "Just you and me." The gold, the promise of a new life, lay forgotten beneath the floorboards, a worthless relic in the face of imminent threat. As she dragged them out of the room, Ilara heard a new sound, a loud scrape coming from one of the downstairs windows, as if sharp claws were testing the glass. The sound was sharper, more desperate, and seemed to come from multiple points around the house. It wasn't just sniffing, it was trying to get in. "Quick!" she whispered, pushing the children towards the front door, the only exit. The night air, once a relief, now seemed laden with an invisible presence. Ilara opened the door cautiously, peering out. The darkness of the night was almost total, but she could make out the silhouettes of the forest trees, an uncertain refuge. But their only hope. The scratching at the window stopped. The silence returned, even heavier, more menacing. Ilara felt the red eyes of the figure in the drawing burn in her mind. It was out there, waiting. "Run!" she ordered, pushing the children out of the house into the cold darkness of the night. "Run and don't look back." She was the last to leave. Closing the door behind her with a soft thud, the fireplace poker still in her hand, the crumpled drawing in the other. The village, once a promise of salvation, was now a deadly trap. The hunt had begun. And they, Ilara and her children, were the prey. The sound of the wind, which once seemed to play in the cracks, now sounded like a lament, a final warning. The forest awaited them. But what awaited them in the forest was a question Ilara dared not ask. The cold night air whipped their faces as Ilara pushed the children out of the house into the oppressive darkness. The forest, once a promise of refuge, now rose like an impenetrable wall of shadows and unknown sounds. Every leaf that crunched under their bare feet was a scream, every breaking branch a shot in the deadly silence. "Run!" she whispered again, her voice hoarse with panic, but the order was unnecessary. The instinct for survival had already taken hold of the little ones. Tiago, the youngest, stumbled with each step, clutching Ilara's hand with surprising strength. Anna, the eldest, led the way, her eyes wide, trying to pierce the blackness, her small body trembling. Pedro and Sofia, one on each side of Ilara, ran as if their lives depended on it, and indeed they did. The fireplace poker, still in her hand, seemed a useless weight, a piece of metal against an invisible and untamable threat. The crumpled drawing, with its red eyes and the word "flee," was clutched in the other, a macabre prophecy that had come true. They dared not look back. The house, once a beacon of hope, was now a dark and threatening silhouette, swallowed by the shadows of the abandoned village. The sound of scratching at the window, a sharp and desperate scrape, still echoed in their ears, a vivid reminder of the thing that pursued them. But now the sound came from behind them, not from the house but from the edge of the forest. A rustling of leaves, heavier than the wind, more deliberate than an animal. It was moving, it was following them. The forest was a labyrinth of twisted trunks and intertwined branches. Moonlight, when it managed to penetrate the dense canopy, created ghostly patterns on the ground, transforming every shadow into a menacing figure. Ilara felt her heart pound erratically, the cold air burning her lungs. She didn't know where she was going, only away from that cursed village. Each step was a silent prayer, a plea for the forest to swallow them, to hide them from the thing that hunted them. A branch snapped loudly. Very close, Ilara turned her head sharply, her eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. Nothing. Just the indistinct shapes of the trees. But the rustling intensified, coming from her right, then her left. It seemed the creature was circling them, playing with its prey, testing its limits. The whisper, that unmistakable sound that had come from the roof, now seemed to echo in the depths of the forest, a drawn-out guttural melody that seemed to call their names. "Mum," Anna whispered, her voice choked with suppressed tears. "I'm scared." Ilara squeezed Tiago's hand and pulled Anna closer. "I know, my love, but we need to be strong. We need to keep going." She tried to keep her voice steady, but felt a tear trace a cold, lonely path down her face. How could she protect them from something she couldn't see, something that seemed to be the very embodiment of fear? The red-eyed figure from the drawing danced in her mind, now with terrifying clarity, as if it were about to materialize at any moment. They ran for a few more minutes, exhaustion beginning to take its toll. The children's small bodies were at their limit, their steps slower, their whimpers more frequent. Ilara knew they couldn't continue like this for long. They needed a place to hide, even if only for a brief moment, to catch their breath and plan their next move. Suddenly, Ilara spotted a clearing ahead, a small space where the trees parted, revealing a dark, irregular rock formation. There seemed to be a small crevice, an opening in the rock, a cave, perhaps. A faint hope rose in her chest. "There!" she pointed, her voice an urgent whisper. "Let's go there." With a final effort, they dragged themselves towards the rock. The crevice was narrow, barely allowing an adult to pass, but the children could squeeze through. Ilara pushed Anna first, then Pedro and Sofia, and finally, Tiago. She squeezed in behind them, the fireplace poker scraping against the stone, the crumpled drawing still in her hand. The space was damp and cramped, smelling of earth and stone, but it offered a temporary refuge from the darkness of the forest and the thing that pursued them. Inside, in the muffled silence of the small cave, the children huddled against Ilara, their small bodies trembling. Tiago began to cry softly, a choked sound Ilara tried to soothe with caresses and whispers. "Shh, my love. We're safe here. For now." But the silence outside didn't last. The rustling of leaves resumed, closer now, right at the cave entrance. A scratching sound, like claws scraping against rock, made their hearts leap. The creature had found their hiding place. The smell of mold and damp earth in the cave was suddenly overwhelmed by a strange odor, a pungent metallic scent that Ilara couldn't identify, but which seemed to permeate the air with a sense of malice. Then a sound, not a whisper, not a scratch, a soft thump, coming from within the cave itself, deeper than where they were. As if something had stirred in the bowels of the rock, a sound that didn't belong to the outside world, but seemed to come from an even older, darker place. Ilara froze, her body tense, the fireplace poker raised, ready for a useless confrontation. The thing outside was at the entrance. But what was inside here? The terror that had driven her into the cave now trapped her. They were cornered. The forest, the house, the village, everything was a trap, and the gold, the promise of a new life, lay forgotten, a cruel irony in the face of imminent death. The hunt hadn't ended. It had merely changed its setting, and the prey, Ilara and her children, were now caught between two threats, one visible in the darkness and another, even more terrifying, hidden in the depths of the earth. The whisper now seemed to come from all sides, a macabre melody announcing the end. The thin air of the cave transformed into an icy shroud. The soft thump, coming from the depths of the rock, resonated in Ilara's ears like a hammer striking a rusty gong. It wasn't the sound of an animal moving, nor the crack of a falling stone. It was something heavier, more deliberate, and carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The pungent metallic smell, once subtle, now suffocated, mingling with the mold and damp earth, as if the very air was corrupting. The children, huddled against her, felt the same. Tiago, who had been whimpering softly, was now in terrified silence, his face buried in Ilara's side. Ana, Pedro, and Sofia, their small bodies trembling, stared into the darkness ahead, from where the sound had come, their eyes wide with dread. The threat outside, the persistent scratching at the cave entrance, seemed almost a relief compared to the unknown horror stirring in the bowels of the earth. Ilara raised the fireplace poker, the cold, heavy metal in her hand, a pathetic defense against whatever lurked. Her eyes, already accustomed to the gloom, tried to pierce the denser darkness that stretched beyond the small recess where they were. There was a bend, a narrow tunnel that delved deeper into the rock, and it was from there that the thump came. The crumpled drawing, with its red eyes and the word "flee," was clutched so tightly in her other hand that her knuckles ached. The prophecy was unfolding in ways she could never have imagined. The scratching at the cave entrance intensified, becoming more frantic, more desperate. A low, guttural growl, almost a lament, escaped the creature outside, a sound that spoke of frustration and hunger. It seemed the thing was trying to force its way in, testing the rock's resistance. A heavy thump shook the cave, sending small stones and dust falling from the ceiling. The creature was pounding against the entrance, its fury palpable. But the thump from within didn't wait. It came again, stronger this time and closer. Thump, thump. A slow, heavy rhythm, like a giant heart beating in the depths of the earth. The metallic smell became almost unbearable, with a hint of something rusty, something ancient and forgotten. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. That wasn't an animal. It was something older, darker, perhaps even inorganic. "Mom," Ana whispered, her voice so thin it almost got lost in the silence. "What is that?" Ilara had no answer. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a plan, anything. But they were cornered. The creature outside, hungry and relentless, and the thing inside, awakening from a millennial slumber. The thump-thump repeated, and this time Ilara swore she saw a faint, reddish glow flicker in the darkness of the tunnel, like an eye slowly opening. It wasn't the vivid, malevolent gleam of the creature in the drawing, but a dull, almost dying glow that seemed to come from something metallic and ancient. The growl outside transformed into a prolonged howl, a sound that seemed to tear the very night, echoing through the forest trees. The creature was furious, and its fury was becoming dangerously impatient. Another violent thump struck the cave entrance, and this time a crack formed in the rock, allowing a trickle of cold air and the smell of the forest to enter, mingling with the metallic, foul odor from within. Ilara pressed the children against her, her heart beating in unison with the thump-thump coming from the tunnel. She felt the warmth of their small bodies, the fragility of their lives, and a wave of despair and fury washed over her. She couldn't leave them. She couldn't. The reddish glow in the tunnel intensified slightly, revealing an indistinct shape. Something large, heavy, and that seemed to be slowly dragging itself out of the shadows. The sound of the thump-thump was now accompanied by a metallic dragging, like rusty chains being pulled across the stone floor. The thing inside was moving. It was coming. Ilara backed up as far as she could, her back hitting the cold cave wall. The fireplace poker was raised, but she knew it was useless. She was caught between the hunter and the hunted, between the beast of the forest and whatever this ancient horror was, dormant beneath the earth. The whisper, which before seemed to come from all sides, now seemed to concentrate on the cave entrance and the dark tunnel, a macabre melody of condemnation. The hunt hadn't ended. It had merely transformed into an even deeper nightmare, and Ilara and her children were at its heart, with no hope of escape. The gold, the promise of a new life, was a distant memory, a cruel irony in the face of imminent death. The gold, the promise of a new life, was a distant memory, a cruel irony in the face of imminent death. The thump-thump from the depths of the cave was no longer a distant sound. It was a pulsation, a slow and powerful beat that seemed to resonate directly in Ilara's bones, a primal rhythm echoing the very beat of her terrified heart. The metallic dragging, once subtle, was now a heavy, continuous sound, like something immense and rusty being pulled across a rough surface, each scrape sending shivers down Ilara's spine. The reddish glow in the tunnel ahead was no longer a mere glimpse. It grew, it pulsed, a dull, sickly light that seemed to come from an ancient furnace, slowly revealing the silhouette of something colossal and shapeless. They weren't eyes, Ilara realized with icy horror, but an internal incandescence, a dying heat emanating from a dark, irregular mass that moved with agonizing slowness. It seemed to be made of corroded metal and stone, with protrusions and indentations that suggested a form defying any natural description. It was an abomination, a relic of a forgotten time, awakening from a slumber that should have lasted forever. Outside, the creature's fury reached a deafening peak. The howl transformed into a guttural growl, laden with impatience and a palpable hunger. More violent thumps shook the cave, and the crack in the entrance widened with a dry snap, releasing a gust of cold air and a nauseating smell of wet earth, and something wild, something carnivorous. Small stones and dust fell from the ceiling, and Ilara could see, through the widening crack, the darkness of the forest and the promise of sharp claws. The creature was forcing its way in, and the rock wouldn't hold much longer. "Mum!" Tiago sobbed, his face wet with tears, but the sound muffled by terror. Ana, Pedro, and Sofia were motionless, their eyes fixed alternately on the crack opening to the forest and on the intensifying reddish glow in the tunnel. They were small boats adrift in a sea of fear, and Ilara was the only anchor, an anchor about to give way. The fireplace poker in her hand seemed ridiculous, a useless toy against the two threats surrounding them. The crumpled drawing, with the word "flee" and the red eyes, was now clutched so tightly in her other hand that the paper was almost disintegrating. She looked at the crack, then at the tunnel. There was nowhere to go. They were trapped. The thump-thump grew faster, more urgent, and the metallic dragging revealed that the thing was turning a bend in the tunnel, approaching the small recess where they were. The reddish glow danced on the damp cave walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and crawl. Ilara could now distinguish more defined shapes, plates of corroded metal, like ancient armor, attached to a rocky structure, and something that appeared to be a single, large, opaque eye embedded in the mass. It wasn't alive in the sense she knew, but it was undeniably conscious, and it was moving towards them. Outside, the rock cracked again, and a larger piece broke off, falling with a dull thud. Through the now wider opening, Ilara glimpsed a patch of dark fur and an enormous, pointed claw, trying to wedge itself into the crack, scraping the stone with an agonizing sound. The creature was almost getting in. Ilara felt panic rise in her throat, suffocating her. She couldn't fight both. She had to choose. But how? The beast of the forest was a predator, but the thing in the cave seemed to be something from a primordial nightmare, something that wouldn't be content with merely devouring. Suddenly, a different sound, not the thump-thump nor the scratching. A low, vibrant hum began to emanate from the thing in the tunnel, a sound that seemed to penetrate her ears and vibrate in her teeth. The reddish glow intensified, and the air in the cave became heavy. electric, like before a storm. The children cowered even further, their whimpers now silent, replaced by a mute terror. The creature outside, as if sensing the change, also paused for an instant. The growl ceased, and there was a tense silence, broken only by the increasing hum of the internal thing. For a brief moment, the two threats seemed to acknowledge each other, a pause in the hunt, a hesitation. But the pause was ephemeral. The hum of the internal thing transformed into a sharp hiss, and the reddish glow expanded, revealing that the mass of metal and rock was unfolding like a monstrous flower from an infernal garden. An arm, or something that resembled an arm, made of rusted plates and stone claws, stretched out from the darkness of the tunnel, dragging itself across the damp floor towards them. At the same time, the creature outside let out a howl of renewed fury, and with a final crash, the cave entrance gave way. The rock split, and the beast of the forest, a dark, furry mass with glowing red eyes, thrust its head and an enormous paw through the opening, its eyes fixed on Elara and her children, a low, menacing growl vibrating in its chest. Elara was between a rock and a hard place. The beast of the forest with its claws and teeth, and the ancient abomination with its reddish glow and slowly extending metallic arm. Her eyes swept over the children, their faces pale and terrified. There was no time to think. There was nowhere to run. The hunt had reached its climax, and they were the prize. The fireplace poker seemed to weigh a ton in her hand, but she raised it, a last, desperate attempt to protect her children, even though she knew it was futile. The whisper now was no longer a macabre melody, but a silent scream of despair echoing in the depths of the cave, announcing the end. The fireplace poker trembled in Elara's hands, not from the weight of the metal, but from the uncontrollable force of panic that overwhelmed her. Her children clung to her, small, trembling bodies, their faces buried in her clothes, wide eyes fixed in terror on the two abominations closing in on them. The smell of wet earth and wild fur mingled with the metallic, foul odor of the tunnel, creating a nauseating atmosphere that suffocated the air and hope. Outside, the beast of the forest, a mass of muscle and fury, forced its way in. Its head, with red eyes glowing like embers in hell, and an enormous sharp-clawed paw, were already inside the cave. The guttural growl vibrating in its chest was a primal sound of the hunt, a promise of pain and annihilation. It scraped the rock with its claws, widening the crack, and Elara could feel the cold air and dampness of the forest night invading their small refuge, bringing with it the imminence of death. The creature was hungry, and its patience had run out. But the threat from within was even more disturbing. The metallic arm, made of corroded plates and stone claws, slowly extended from the darkness of the tunnel, dragging itself across the damp floor with a scraping, heavy sound. The reddish glow emanating from the shapeless mass intensified, pulsing like a diseased heart, revealing more details of that monstrosity. Pointed protrusions, dark indentations, and what appeared to be a single, large, opaque eye embedded in the structure. It was not a living being in the sense Elara knew, but the consciousness radiating from it was undeniable, and its approach was slow, inexorable, like the arrival of a nightmare from which one could not awaken. The low, vibrant hum coming from the thing in the tunnel transformed into a sharp hiss, a sound that seemed to tear the air and penetrate her bones, making Elara's teeth ache. The air in the cave became heavy, electric, charged with an oppressive energy. The children cowered even further, their whimpers now silent, replaced by a mute terror reflected in their wide eyes. Suddenly, the whisper, which had been a macabre melody of condemnation, transformed. It was no longer a distant sound, but a voice, or perhaps a sensation, that seemed to resonate directly in Elara's mind, ignoring the surrounding chaos. It was a wordless sound, yet laden with a chilling urgency, a pressure that seemed to push her, not away from the creatures, but into the darkness of the tunnel. The beast of the forest, as if struck by an invisible force, let out a howl of pain and fury, retreating slightly from the cave entrance, its red eyes flickering in confusion. The metallic arm of the internal thing also stopped advancing, the reddish glow flickering for an instant, and the sharp hiss transformed into a sibilant sound, almost a warning. For a brief and terrifying moment, the two threats seemed to have been affected, not by Ilara, but by something older, more powerful, emanating from the depths of the earth. Ilara felt a tug on her arm, and Anna, the eldest, pointed with a trembling finger at the crumpled drawing in her hand. The word "flee" seemed to dance before her eyes, and suddenly the silent voice in Ilara's mind became clearer, more insistent. Flee. Not outward, inward. It was madness. To run into the darkness, into the embrace of the metallic abomination, was suicide. But the entrance was blocked by the beast of the forest, and the creature of the tunnel, though terrible, seemed to have been momentarily held back by the whisper. It was a choice between certain death and an infinitesimal chance of survival, a chance that the voice in her mind seemed to beg her to take. Her eyes swept the dark tunnel, where the reddish glow still pulsed, but the metallic arm had retreated slightly. She looked at the beast of the forest, which now growled, but seemed hesitant, its red eyes sweeping the cave, as if searching for the source of the disturbance. The creature was wounded, or perhaps just confused. It was the only window they would have. "Run!" Ilara cried, her voice hoarse with terror and despair, pushing the children forward, into the darkness of the tunnel. She didn't know where to go, what she would find, but the voice in her mind was now a chorus of urgency, a silent scream that propelled her into the unknown. The gold, the promise of a new life, was a distant memory, a cruel irony in the face of imminent death, but the lives of her children, that was the only currency that mattered now. As the children stumbled into the darkness, Ilara turned for an instant, raising the fireplace poker at the beast of the forest, a futile gesture, but one that bought precious seconds. The creature's growl intensified, and it advanced again, but the whisper, or the voice, or whatever it was, seemed to envelop the cave in a wave of pressure, making the beast hesitate once more. Ilara didn't wait. With one last look at the creature's red eyes and at the metallic mass pulsing at the back of the tunnel, she turned and ran, pushing the children forward into the darkness that promised both death and an impossible escape. The thump-thump from the depths of the cave was no longer a distant pulsation. It was the rhythm of her own desperate flight, a macabre drum guiding them into the heart of the nightmare. The fireplace poker still trembled in Ilara's hands, but there was no more time to hesitate. The furious howl of the beast of the forest echoed behind them, a sound promising relentless pursuit. Ahead, the darkness of the tunnel swallowed her children, small figures who stumbled and cried, guided only by despair and Ilara's firm hand. The air inside was heavy, damp, with a metallic and earthy smell that seemed to impregnate her lungs. It wasn't the smell of an ordinary cave. There was something ancient, almost electric, that vibrated in the air. The voice in her mind, once a whisper, was now a silent but undeniable command. Inward, deeper. It was madness, a blind leap into the abyss. But the terror of the beast outside was tangible, and the metallic creature, though terrifying, seemed to be the only one to offer a path, or at least a distraction. Ilara pushed the older children, Anna and Miguel, who in turn pulled the younger ones, Sofia and little Tiago, who could barely keep his eyes open, but clung to his brother with surprising strength. The tunnel was not a natural passage. The walls were of dark rock, but smooth in some places, as if they had been polished or shaped by something other than nature. There were strange indentations, almost like niches, And the floor, though uneven, seemed to have been trodden for centuries, perhaps millennia. The reddish glow of the metallic creature, which had pulsed in the recess, now seemed to have dissipated, or perhaps it was just further ahead, waiting. The thump-thump was no longer a distant sound, but a pulsation that seemed to come from within the very walls, an underground heartbeat that enveloped them, becoming the rhythm of their escape. Anna, still clutching the crumpled drawing, looked at Ilara, her eyes wide, but with a flicker of understanding. "Mommy, the voice. It's telling us where to go," she whispered, her small voice almost inaudible over the distant growl of the beast and the increasing hum of the cave. Ilara nodded, wordless. The voice didn't speak in words, but in sensations, a gentle pressure to the right, an urgent push forward, a chilling warning to stop. They pressed on, groping in the near-total darkness. Ilara used the fireplace poker to test the ground ahead, fearing abysses or traps. With each step, the fear that the metallic creature would reveal itself again, or that the tunnel would end in a dead end, was almost as great as the fear of the beast outside. But the voice, this strange and silent guide, propelled them onward. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. It was not a natural chamber. The walls were smoother, almost polished, and in the center there was a structure. Ilara could barely distinguish its contours in the gloom, but it seemed to be a massive pillar, made of the same dark, polished rock, stretching from floor to ceiling. The thump-thump was stronger here, vibrating through the floor and walls, and the air was charged with an almost palpable energy. The voice in Ilara's mind intensified, no longer a whisper, but a wave of information, a torrent of images and sensations that overwhelmed her for an instant. She saw flashes, the village, but not as she knew it, rather as it was long ago, vibrant, full of people. Then darkness, flight, calamity, and then the gold, not as a treasure, but as a seal, a protection, and the metallic creature not an abomination, but a guardian, dormant, now awakening. The children cowered, sensing the change in the atmosphere, the weight of that silent revelation. Ilara felt a pang of headache, as if her mind was being forced to process something it wasn't prepared to understand. The metallic creature was not a threat, at least not to them. It was the village's guardian, the protector of secrets, and the gold was part of its purpose, and the beast of the forest. The beast was the threat the guardian had put to sleep for centuries, and which was now back. The voice or the entity generating it seemed to be communicating with her, not through words, but through a direct transmission of intent and history. And the intent was now clear. They needed to go deeper, to the heart of the guardian, to the place where the power was strongest. It was the only way to stop the beast, the only way to protect what remained. Ilara looked at the central pillar. There was an opening, a dark crevice at its base, almost imperceptible. The voice urged her there. It was a tight space, barely enough for one person to squeeze through. She hesitated for an instant. To enter there meant surrendering completely to the unknown, to the embrace of that ancient intelligence. But the beast's growl outside was growing closer again, and the sound of falling stones indicated it was finding a way to bypass the distraction. "Come," Ilara said, her voice hoarse but firm. "We have to go that way." She pointed to the crevice in the pillar. The children, though terrified, trusted her. Anna went first, squeezing through the opening, followed by Miguel, who helped Sofia and Tiago pass. Ilara was last, feeling the cold, polished rock against her body, the absolute darkness swallowing her. As soon as she passed, the crevice seemed to close slightly, not completely, but enough for the faint light of the chamber to become a mere thread. The thump-thump was now deafening, seeming to come from all directions. They were inside the guardian, or its innermost domain. The voice in Ilara's mind calmed, transforming into a constant presence, a beacon in the darkness. They weren't just fleeing, they were being guided to a greater purpose. to a confrontation Ilara could barely comprehend. The fireplace poker was still in her hand, but she knew her true weapon now was faith, and the strange alliance she had made with the pulsing heart of the mountain. The darkness that swallowed them inside the crevice was not merely the absence of light. It was a dense, almost palpable darkness that seemed to absorb sound and hope itself. Ilara felt the cold, polished rock against her face. The metallic and earthy smell intensified, and the thump-thump that was once a rhythm was now a deafening vibration that resonated in her bones, in her very blood. It was the heartbeat of something immense, ancient, alive. The children cowered, their small bodies trembling against hers. Anna, with her small hand, fumbled for Ilara's arm, a silent gesture of seeking safety. Miguel, behind her, breathed with difficulty, childish fear almost suffocating him. Sofia and Tiago, the youngest, were somewhere in the darkness, but Ilara could feel their muffled whimpers, their fears mingling with her own. The crevice was not a tunnel. It was an irregular, tight passage that seemed to twist inward into the rock itself. Ilara had to turn sideways, pushing the children ahead with her body, feeling claustrophobia tighten her chest. The fireplace poker, once a symbol of her courage, was now a hindrance. But she held it like an amulet, a last connection to the world she knew. The voice in her mind, the beacon in the darkness, didn't speak in words, but in a continuous stream of sensations. It was a gentle pressure forward, a comforting warmth in a moment of panic, a fleeting image of a path ahead. There was no light, but the voice was her sight, guiding them through that labyrinth of living stone. Suddenly, the passage opened slightly, allowing Ilara to move with a little more freedom. There wasn't a chamber, but rather a series of narrow corridors, all made of the same dark, polished rock. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with the energy of the thump-thump, which was now less a sound and more a constant vibrating sensation, as if they were inside a gigantic organic engine. The voice intensified, and a new torrent of images and information flooded Ilara's mind. She saw the village again, but this time the vision was clearer, more detailed. They weren't just people, they were beings with a wisdom and technology that defied her comprehension. They weren't human, but something more. Ancient. They had built the Guardian, not as a weapon, but as a refuge. A seal against a darkness that came from outside, the beast of the forest. It wasn't just an animal. It was a nightmare creature, a manifestation of that primordial darkness, a plague that had swept the earth eons ago. The Guardian had been activated to contain it, to seal it, and the gold Ilara had found, was not a treasure, but the remnants of the energy that maintained the seal. Each chest was a fragment of a greater power, a remnant of a barrier that was crumbling. And now the beast was returning. The Guardian, dormant for so long, was awakening, but it was weakened, incomplete. It needed something or someone. It needed her. The voice became clearer, more demanding. You are the key, the blood of the earth, the spirit of life. You can reactivate. You can seal. Ilara stumbled, the images and mental pressure almost knocking her down. What could she do? She was just a widow, a desperate mother. But the voice left no room for doubt. She felt a tug on her soul, a deep connection with that ancient intelligence, as if her thoughts and fears were laid bare to it. "Mommy, what's happening?" Anna whispered, her voice trembling, but with a courage Ilara barely recognized. I feel like we're being drawn in." "We are, my love," Ilara replied, her voice hoarse. "We are being guided." They continued to advance. The path seemed to descend, and the air grew denser, heavier. The thump-thump was now a constant hum, an underground melody that seemed to vibrate in every cell of their bodies. The fireplace poker, still in her hand, felt heavy, useless. Suddenly, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. There was no light, but the darkness here was different. It wasn't absolute. There was a faint, almost imperceptible glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a deep pulsing blue that barely illuminated the chamber's contours. In the center of the chamber, there was a structure. It was an altar, or perhaps a throne, made of the same polished rock, but with intricate engravings that seemed to move and shift in the bluish gloom. And above it, suspended in the air, pulsed a crystal. It wasn't an ordinary crystal. It was enormous, the size of a child, and radiated the same blue light, but with an intensity that made the air tingle. It was the heart, the Guardian's heart. The voice in Ilara's mind was no longer a guide. It was a chorus, a symphony of intent. The heart, the power, your touch, your blood. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. Her blood. What did that mean? The growl of the beast of the forest, which seemed to have been muffled by the depth of the cave, now echoed again, closer than ever. It didn't come from behind them, but seemed to come from above, from somewhere above the chamber, as if the creature was trying to pierce the mountain's ceiling to reach them. The ground trembled, and small stones fell from the ceiling, raising dust. There was no more time to hesitate, to question. The voice was now a silent scream, an urgency that propelled her forward. Ilara looked at her children, their faces pale and terrified, but their eyes fixed on her, waiting. She approached the altar, her steps echoing in the heavy silence of the chamber, broken only by the hum of the crystal and the distant growl of the beast. The crystal pulsed, inviting and menacing. It was their only hope. It was their only chance. Ilara extended her hand, the fireplace poker falling with a dull thud onto the stone floor. Her fingers trembled as she approached the crystal, feeling the warmth and energy radiating from it. The voice in her mind became a single powerful command: touch, activate, save. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and touched the crystal. The instant her skin met the cold, smooth surface of the pulsating stone, a wave of blue energy erupted from the chamber, and a scream, not hers, but from the mountain itself, echoed through the depths of the earth. The instant Ilara's skin touched the cold, smooth surface of the pulsating crystal, the world exploded. It wasn't just a scream from the mountain, it was a primal roar that tore through the air, the rock, and reality itself. A wave of blue energy, more intense than 1,000 suns, erupted from the crystal, engulfing Ilara and spreading through the chamber, through the corridors, and finally through the entire mountain. Her eyes were closed, but she saw. A torrent of images, sounds, and sensations flooded her mind, a symphony of millennia of history, technology, and despair. She saw the builders, beings of light and wisdom, not human, but guardians of cosmic knowledge. They had foreseen the plague, the darkness that manifested as the beast, and built the Guardian, not a machine, but a living organism of stone and energy, a seal against the void. The gold, yes. The gold was condensed energy, the remnants of its vital power, scattered like seeds to one day, perhaps, be found and reactivated. And the beast. The beast was not merely flesh and claws. It was the personification of oblivion, of entropy, a force that sought to devour all life and light. The Guardian had sealed it, but time and neglect had weakened the bonds, and the beast was breaking free. Ilara felt her own body vibrate, not from pain, but from a deep resonance. The thump-thump of the Guardian's heart was now her own heartbeat, and the blood running in her veins seemed to mingle with the blue energy of the crystal. She wasn't just touching it, she was becoming part of it. The voice in her mind was no longer a guide, but a fusion of consciousnesses, a collective memory pouring into her. You are the key. The blood of the earth, the spirit of life. You reactivate, you seal. She understood what it meant. Her essence, Her vital strength as a mother, as a survivor, as an intrinsic part of nature, was the catalyst the Guardian needed to fully reactivate. Outside, or perhaps above them, the beast's growl transformed into a howl of agony. The wave of blue energy, now radiating from the mountain like a beacon, struck the creature with the force of 1,000,000 thunderbolts. It wasn't a physical attack, but a seal of light, a barrier of pure energy that enveloped it. Elara felt the beast's struggle, the fury and despair of an ancient entity being imprisoned once more. The ground trembled violently, not from attack, but from the mountain itself reorganizing, its stone entrails closing, sealing the cracks and passages the beast had opened. The howl diminished, transforming into a distant lament, until finally it silenced. The beast had been contained again. When Elara opened her eyes, the chamber was no longer in gloom. The crystal pulsed with a soft, constant blue glow, illuminating every detail of the engravings on the altar, which seemed to dance with life. The children were huddled behind her, but their faces, once pale with terror, now reflected a mixture of awe and relief. Anna, Miguel, Sofia, and Tiago. They were safe. Elara felt different. There was no pain, no exhaustion, but a mental clarity and a sense of connection to the world around her that she had never experienced. It was as if she could feel the mountain's breath, the flow of underground water, the growth of the trees in the forest above. The fireplace poker, which had fallen, lay forgotten on the ground. She no longer needed it. Her true strength came not from a piece of metal, but from the life she carried, from the faith she had maintained. The voice, now a calm and serene presence in her mind, transmitted a final message. The seal is complete. The Guardian is active. Life will flourish again. Elara turned to her children, a tired but radiant smile on her lips. "It's all right, my loves," she whispered, her voice soft yet imbued with a new authority. "The beast is gone. We are safe." The children, still a little dazed, approached, embracing her. Fear was subsiding, replaced by curiosity and the promise of a new day. Elara knew the journey hadn't ended. She had reactivated the Guardian, but now she was part of it. Her connection was permanent, a responsibility she would carry forever. She was the Guardian of the Guardian, the bridge between the old and the new. They left the chamber, the way back now illuminated by a faint blue glow emanating from the walls themselves. The darkness was no longer threatening, but welcoming. The thump-thump had calmed, becoming a soft, constant rhythm, the melody of renewed life. As they emerged from the crevice in the central pillar, the main chamber was bathed in a soft, golden light from the outside. The air was fresh, clean. The village outside seemed to breathe again. There was no longer the beast's growl, only the song of birds and the whisper of the wind. Elara looked at the pillar, at the crevice that had led them into the depths. She knew the Guardian was there, dormant but vigilant, its energy pulsing softly beneath the earth, protecting the village and its secrets, and the chests of gold. They were still there in every house, a tangible reminder of the energy that had been released, a treasure that now held a far greater meaning than mere wealth. It was the promise of a future, the foundation of a new life. With her children by her side, Elara walked out of the chamber towards the sunlight. The village, once a place of mystery and danger, was now a sanctuary. She was no longer just a destitute widow with 4 children. She was Elara, the Guardian, the mother who had saved her world and who would now build a new one. With the wisdom of the ancients and the hope of a bright future, the adventure had ended, but the story of Elara and her village, now safe and prosperous, was just beginning.